shattering sound, a trembling voice. "I'm sorry. Please don't be angry." The girl knelt on the marble floor, her bare hands picking up the shards of glass. Blood seeped out, but she dared not stop. Because for 24 years of her life, stopping meant punishment. But the man at the head of the room didn't look at the broken glass. He looked at her scarred hands, burn scars, knife scars, broken fingers that hadn't healed properly. And for the first time in years, Lucien Voss, the man feared by the entire east coast of America, felt something stirring inside his chest. Where are you watching from? Please like and comment below to let me know how far my story has come. And stay until the end, because this is only the beginning. The glass had barely hit the floor before Rowan was already moving. She dropped to her knees so fast her kneecaps cracked against the marble, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the ringing silence that followed the shatter. Her hands went out before she had time to think about it, fingers closing around the largest curved shard first, then sweeping in smaller pieces, the reflex so deep in her body it didn't pass through her brain at all. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice came out thin, higher than she intended. "I'm sorry. I'll clean it up. Please don't." She stopped herself, bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper. Her fingers kept moving, stacking fragments in her palm with a careful efficiency that came from years of practice. How to clean up fast, how to make the evidence disappear, how to shrink herself so small the anger in a room might miss her entirely. Blood had already come. It always came fast with Crystal, the edges too clean and too cruel. A line opened across the pad of her index finger and she kept going, ignoring it, stacking, gathering, thinking about nothing except making the floor clean again before stop. One word. Quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't need volume behind it because the authority was already built in. Rowan's hands froze. She didn't look up. She'd learned a long time ago that looking up too soon could be read as defiance, and defiance had its own price. She kept her eyes on the floor, on the remaining arc of crystal near the table leg, on the thin thread of blood working its way down toward her wrist. Lucien Voss crossed the dining room in 5 steps. She tracked him by sound, the particular weight of his footfall on the stone, the way the room rearranged itself around him without him asking it to. He crouched down in front of her, which she hadn't expected, and the unexpectedness of it made her flinch before she could stop herself. He didn't comment on the flinch. He was looking at her hands. Rowan became aware of her hands the way she sometimes became aware of her face in photographs. Suddenly, and with the particular discomfort of seeing something familiar from outside yourself. They were not pretty hands. They had never been pretty hands. The index finger that had been broken in 3 places and healed without being set properly. The circular scar on the back of her right hand that she'd stopped trying to explain to people. The thin pale line that ran from the base of her thumb almost to her wrist, from something that happened the winter she was 16. She wanted to pull them away. She didn't. "How long have you worked here?" Lucien asked. 11 days, she said, then added automatically, "Sir." "Before that?" She hesitated. "I was placed through the agency. Before that I was—" She stopped. "I was at home." The word home came out wrong, and she knew it immediately. A hollow sound with no warmth inside it, and she felt Lucien register the wrongness even though he didn't say anything. He stood, reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, and came out with a folded white handkerchief, the kind of thing nobody under 50 carried anymore, pressed flat and clean, and held it down toward her. Rowan stared at it for a second. "Your hand," he said. She took the handkerchief, pressed it against the cut on her finger without wrapping it, because wrapping it would have meant setting down the glass pieces, and she hadn't been told she could do that yet. The fabric came away pink almost immediately. "Leave the glass," Lucien said. "Someone else will get it." "I don't mind." "I know you don't." Something in his voice shifted. Not softer exactly, more careful. "Leave it anyway. Volteg." She ate alone that night, the way she always ate. In the kitchen after the main staff had cleared out, standing at the counter rather than sitting at the small table near the window. Sitting felt like claiming something. Standing felt like remaining ready to move. The estate was large enough that most of the time she could move through it without crossing paths with anyone who mattered. That was by design, she knew. The household was run with the kind of clockwork precision that kept different people in different orbits. The security detail had their own patterns. The senior staff had theirs. The temporary hires, the cleaners, and the kitchen workers who came and went on rotation occupied the margins. Rowan was good at margins. She'd been placed here through a domestic staffing agency, the kind of arrangement that didn't come with much paperwork or many questions, which was one of the reasons she'd taken it. The woman at the agency had looked at Rowan's references and then looked at Rowan and said the position was for a temporary position at a private estate, and that discretion was expected. Rowan had said that wouldn't be a problem. It hadn't been. She kept her head down. She did the work. The dusting, the silver polishing, the specific tasks assigned each morning on a printed sheet left on the kitchen counter. She didn't ask about things that weren't her business. She didn't make friends with the other staff because friendships required reciprocity, and reciprocity required revealing things. And Rowan had learned early that the things she might reveal about herself tended to make people uncomfortable in ways that eventually became her problem. What she hadn't accounted for was being seen. That was the thing about the incident with the glass. Not the breaking. She'd broken things before, and the particular cold dread that came with it was old and familiar as a bruise that never quite healed. What she hadn't accounted for was someone crouching down to look at her hands like they were trying to read something written there. She pressed the handkerchief. She'd washed it out and left it folded on the edge of the sink, unsure of the protocol for returning it, against her finger again, and ate the rest of her rice standing up, listening to the house settle around her. Lucien didn't do it immediately. That was the thing about him that most people who dealt with him secondhand never understood. They expected a man like him to move fast, loud, decisive, the blunt instrument of his own reputation. But he'd learned a long time ago that the information worth having was the kind you gathered quietly, from angles people didn't know you were watching from. He made a call to Damon Reyes, who handled the kind of research that didn't appear on any invoice. The girl, he said, housekeeper, Rowan Hale, came through the Caldwell agency. How deep? Background, family, wherever she came from before she came here. Damon called back in 36 hours. Lucien was in his study when the call came through, standing at the window that looked out over the east grounds. He listened without speaking for almost 4 minutes, which was long for him. What Damon had found wasn't complicated. That was almost the worst part. It wasn't a labyrinthine conspiracy or a set of secrets that required specialized knowledge to unearth. It was documented, reported, in some cases, though the reports had gone nowhere. A paper trail of silence and closed doors, and people who had looked away because looking away was easier, and because the people involved were the kind of people who made looking away feel like the sensible choice. Rowan had been placed with Elias and Vivian Hale at age 6 through the state foster system. The placement had become a legal guardianship within 18 months. On paper, the arrangement was a success story. A child given stability, 2 philanthropists providing a loving home, a narrative that had appeared in abbreviated form in a gala program for a children's welfare foundation that Vivian sat on the board of. The gap between the paper and the reality was measurable in old medical records, in a school counselor's note from when Rowan was 11, that had been filed and apparently never followed up on, in the 3 separate occasions where neighbors had made calls that had been resolved at the front door with Elias Hale's polished reassurance and Vivian's carefully maintained look of gentle concern. Damon read him the list of documented injuries over the years. Lucien stood at the window and let the list come in without interrupting. When it was over, there was a brief silence. The foundation, Lucien said. The Hale Foundation. What does it actually do? Officially, children's welfare, youth programs, some international work. Damon paused. Unofficially, I'm still pulling threads. But there are financial flows that don't make sense for a nonprofit that size. Money going in and out through structures that look like they're built to be hard to follow. Keep pulling. You want this documented? Lucien thought about the handkerchief. The way Rowan had stared at it for a half second, like she wasn't sure what the gesture meant, like she was running through a mental catalog of possible interpretations trying to identify the catch. Yeah, he said. Document everything. She found the envelope on the small table outside her room on the 14th morning. It was plain white, her name written on the front in Vivian Hale's handwriting, a hand Rowan would have recognized in her sleep, looped and controlled and decorative in a way that always reminded her of a signature rather than actual writing. Like everything Vivian did, it was performed. Rowan stood in the corridor holding it for a long moment before she opened it. The letter was short, 4 sentences. The language was pleasant in the way that a trap can be pleasant, offering a comfortable surface to step onto before it gives way underneath you. It said that Rowan had been away long enough. It said that her place was at home. It said that Elias and Vivian missed her and were eager for her return. It said that they hoped she would make arrangements promptly, and that they trusted she understood what was meant by promptly. She read it twice. Then she folded it back along the original crease and put it in the pocket of her uniform and went to do her morning work, because she'd learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do when afraid was let the fear stop your hands from moving. She polished the silver in the east drawing room for 40 minutes, working through the candlesticks methodically, and told herself she wasn't shaking. Her hands were shaking. By the time she reached the 3rd candlestick, she'd made her decision. She wasn't going back. She didn't know what that meant yet in terms of what came next. Where she would go, how she would manage, what the Hales would do when they understood she meant it. She knew they would do something. They always did something. The Hales were people who didn't accept the word no from people they considered to be in their possession, and Rowan had spent 24 years understanding exactly what category they'd placed her in. But she wasn't going back. She was still sitting with that decision, still feeling it out like a bone that might be cracked, when Lucian appeared in the doorway of the drawing room. He looked at her hands first. He seemed to do that. Notice her hands before her face, which should have felt strange and somehow didn't. "Someone sent you a letter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "From the Hales." Rowan looked up at that. She felt her expression close off the way it always did when she was caught without a script. The automatic blankness, the careful neutral that meant nothing could be read and nothing could be used. "How did you—" She stopped, thought about it. "You've been looking into me." "Yes." She waited for the apology, the justification, the careful framing. It didn't come. He just said yes and left the honesty of it sitting there between them, undecorated. "Why?" she asked. "Because someone should have, a long time ago." He walked into the room and stopped near the fireplace, putting a few feet between them. Not crowding her, she noticed that, the deliberate distance. "What did the letter say?" "That it's time to come home." "Are you going?" The question sat in the air. "No," she said. Something in his face shifted. A very small movement, a slight release of something she hadn't known was held taut until it loosened. "Good," he said, and then, "There are things I need to tell you, about what we found, about the foundation." "I know what they are," Rowan said quietly. He looked at her. "I've always known," she said. "I just never had anywhere to go with it." The silver candlestick sat half-polished in her hands. Outside, the afternoon light was moving across the grounds in long strips, catching on the glass of the windows and throwing pale diamonds across the floor. "You do now?" Lucien said. The response from the Hales came faster than she'd expected. 4 days after the letter, after Rowan had told Lucien she was staying, and Lucien had made it clear, in whatever way he made things clear, that she would be staying safely, the first reports appeared. Elias Hale had contacted a state representative who owed him a series of favors. The story being circulated was precise and designed to land hard, that Rowan, a vulnerable young woman with a troubled history, had been taken in by a known criminal organization and was being held against her will. The word kidnapping appeared in the second news cycle. Damon brought Lucien the information over coffee at 6 in the morning, the kind of meeting where nobody pretended there was a pleasant framing available. Lucien listened, didn't react visibly, asked 2 questions about the source of the representative's relationship with Elias, and then asked Damon to get him the full financial architecture of the Hale Foundation before the end of the week. He told Rowan that afternoon. She was in the kitchen garden when he found her, a narrow strip of herbs and hardy plants along the south wall, the kind of project the estate staff maintained but nobody used much, and which Rowan had started visiting in the early mornings because it was quiet and the soil smelled like something that had no bad associations attached to it. She took the news about the kidnapping narrative standing still with her hands in the pockets of her jeans. She'd started wearing her own clothes over the past week, another small thing she'd noticed herself doing. a series of incremental decisions that each felt enormous from the inside and probably invisible from outside. "They're going to come for me," she said. It wasn't a prediction. It was a statement of pattern, the logical extension of a dynamic she'd watched operate her entire life. Elias doesn't make noise without having something behind it. The legal angle is the distraction. What they're actually doing is buying time. Lucian studied her. For what? To arrange something more direct. She looked at him. There are people the Foundation uses. I've seen them. Men who aren't Foundation employees. They came twice when I was younger. Once when I was 17 and I tried to leave, and once when I was 21. She paused. The second time I ended up in a hospital in another county, and Vivian told the admitting staff I'd had a breakdown and hurt myself. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "I know that. She stopped, pressed her mouth together. "I was waiting to see if this was real. If what was real?" She looked around the kitchen garden, at the rosemary that had grown too leggy, at the narrow strip of sky above the wall. Then she looked back at him. "This," she said. "Any of it. People being—" She shook her head, ran out of words for it. "I kept waiting for the part where it turns out there's a cost." Lucian held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "There's no cost. But there is a situation, and we need to address it before they send those men." "I know," she said. "You're not going to another safe house. You're staying here." "I know that too." He nodded once and turned to go back toward the house, and then stopped, turned back. "The hospital record," he said. "The one from when you were 21. "Do you know which county?" Rowan told him. He nodded again and walked back toward the house, his phone already out of his pocket, and Rowan stood in the kitchen garden in the thin afternoon light, with her hands still in her pockets, and felt something she couldn't quite name shifting inside her chest. Something that wasn't safety yet, wasn't trust yet, but was beginning, very slowly and with considerable wariness, to resemble the distant outline of both. 3 days later, the men came anyway. She was asleep when the first alarm triggered and awake in seconds. That was one thing the Hales had given her without meaning to, a hair-trigger readiness that never fully switched off, the ability to go from sleep to standing in a single second. She was already at the door of her room when she heard the sound from the east corridor. Not a crash, but a very particular absence of the sounds that should have been there. A silence where there should have been the regular radio check from the overnight security. She opened the door. The corridor was dark. At the far end, she could see the shape of someone who wasn't part of the household staff, the particular blocky silhouette of a man wearing tactical gear, moving too carefully to belong to the ordinary geography of this house. Rowan pulled the door closed again. Didn't lock it. The click of a lock could be heard from 20 feet away. She moved to the window, assessed it, found the exterior ledge, and what was beyond it. Her phone was in her hand. She dialed the number Lucian had given her the second day she'd stayed on, after she'd found the first letter, the one he'd said to use if something felt wrong. It rang once. "East corridor," she said, keeping her voice below a whisper. "At least one. Probably more." Lucian's voice came back immediately. No sleep in it, which meant either he hadn't been asleep or he woke faster than she did. "Stay in your room. I'm coming to you." "There's a man between your wing and mine." A pause. "Window?" "I'm looking at it." "Don't go out the window. Wait." She waited. 70 seconds that felt like a different unit of time entirely, stretched and detailed, each sound in the house arriving with unusual clarity. She heard, from somewhere below, a door that shouldn't have opened. She heard, closer, the sound of the man in the corridor stopping and then beginning to move again. And then she heard the sound of something happening very fast and not quietly at the far end of the corridor, and the shape she could see under the door through the thin strip of light shifted and then was gone, and 15 seconds after that there were footsteps she recognized, and a knock. 3, then 2, then 1. That was the pattern Lucien had told her, the one that meant it was him. She opened the door. He was alone. He looked at her face and then looked past her into the room, the professional sweep of a man who operated in environments where assuming everything was fine was how you got killed. There were 4 of them, he said. My security has them. But Rowan, he stopped. She looked at him. One of them had a photograph, he said, of this room, of this wing of the house. His jaw tightened slightly. Someone gave them the layout. The implications of that settled over her like cold water. How? She asked, though she already knew the shape of the answer. That's what I need to find out. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something concerned and something harder underneath it. Are you hurt? No. Good. He held her gaze for a moment. I need you to get dressed. I'm moving you to a different part of the house. And in the morning, you and I are going to have a conversation about everything you know. Everything. About the Hale Foundation and the people who worked for it. Rowan nodded. She started to turn toward the closet, then stopped. Lucien? He was already in the doorway. He turned back. One of the men, she said, in the photograph they had. If they brought a layout of the house, they also brought a plan for what to do with me once they had me. She kept her voice level. She'd had a long time to practice keeping her voice level. Those men don't work for people who let things fail twice. He held her gaze. I know. So whatever's coming next, she said, I want to be part of deciding it, not protected away from it. She paused. They spent 24 years making decisions about my life without asking me. I'm done with that. The hallway was quiet around them. Somewhere below, the sound of his security team moving through the house in systematic sweeps. Lucien looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he'd looked at her hands that first night. And then he said, All right. And in that single quiet agreement, something shifted. Not a resolution, not even the beginning of one, but the clear and irrevocable sense that everything that came next would be different from everything that had come before. The night outside was still and cold, and the Hales, somewhere across the city, were waiting to hear from men who were not going to call. It wasn't elegant work. Lucien's security chief, a compact gray-haired woman named Petra, who moved through the house with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent years in environments where inefficiency got people killed, had run the access logs from the estate's internal system against the shift records before the sun was fully up. The layout that had been given to the four men wasn't a blueprint from a public record or a building permit. It was a hand-drawn reproduction, detailed enough to indicate room numbers and the positions of the overnight security stations. Someone had memorized it. Someone who had been inside. Lucien had everyone who'd cycled through the estate in the past 3 weeks, assembled in the main service corridor by 7 in the morning. There were 11 people. Most of them looked like they hadn't slept. Rowan stood at the edge of the corridor with a coffee she wasn't drinking and watched Lucien work the room. He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing that the people who feared him secondhand never understood. They imagined volume, imagined spectacle, imagined the performance of power. What he did instead was speak at a normal register and let the weight of what he was saying do the work that most people needed theatrics to accomplish. Someone in this corridor gave information about this house to people who came here last night with the intent to take a member of my household by force, he said. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I know who it is yet. What I'm telling you is that I will know. And when I know, the conversation I have with that person will not happen in front of witnesses. Silence. The particular quality of silence that exists in a room where everyone is afraid and everyone is trying not to look like they're afraid. A young man near the back, Rowan had seen him before, one of the rotating kitchen staff, early 20s, a nervous habit of pulling at the collar of his shirt. Pulled at the collar of his shirt. Petra was watching him the same way Rowan was watching him. Lucien didn't look at him. He looked around the room at a measured pace, making brief eye contact with each person in sequence, and then he dismissed them back to their positions. The young man in the back moved toward the corridor exit with everyone else, and that was when Petra touched his elbow and said quietly, "Not you." His name was Joel. He was 23, he'd been with the rotation for 6 weeks, and when Petra put the access records in front of him, the specific interior section that his keycard had accessed on a Thursday morning when his shift assignment had him in the West Kitchen, he lasted 4 minutes before he started talking. Rowan wasn't in the room for that part. She learned it afterward from Damon, who gave information the same way he apparently did everything, efficiently, without decoration, leaving out nothing that was relevant and including nothing that wasn't. Joel had been approached 8 days ago, not by the Hales directly, by a third party, a man who had contacted him through a number he'd gotten from someone Joel had grown up with. A connection so attenuated and indirect that it had probably been designed to feel deniable. The man had asked questions about the layout of the estate, about staffing patterns, about whether there was a young woman working there. Joel had answered those questions because the man had offered money and because Joel was 23 and in debt and had made the calculation that people make when they are 23 and in debt and believe they are operating at the margins of something, not the center of it. He'd been wrong about that. Lucian dealt with Joel without Rowan in the room, and she didn't ask what that looked like. She was sitting in the kitchen with a second cup of coffee. She also wasn't drinking when Lucian came in and sat down across the table from her. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before, not physically diminished, but carrying something behind his eyes that had more weight to it than the night before. "Tell me about the foundation," he said. Rowan set down the cup. "Where do you want to start?" "The money." She exhaled slowly. "The foundation takes in legitimate donations. Large ones. Elias has spent 30 years building relationships with people who have money and like to be seen giving it away. But there are other flows. I didn't understand them when I was younger. I just knew that certain men came to the house who weren't donors. They dressed like donors. They had the same kind of watches. But they came at different times, stayed shorter, and Vivian always sent me upstairs before they arrived. When did you understand what it was?" "I was 19. She turned the cup between her hands. "There was a girl. She was brought to the house as a new foster placement, supposedly. She was 15. I thought she was there to stay. She wasn't there to stay." Rowan stopped, pressed her lips together. "She was there for 3 days. Then a man I'd seen twice before came, and she left with him. Vivian told me she'd been moved to a better placement." Lucian said nothing. "I knew," Rowan said. "I knew what it was. I didn't know how to name it yet, not in a way that felt like it would be believed, but I knew." She finally looked up from the cup, and I knew that if I said anything, I would be the next lesson about what happened to people who said things. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the estate grounds were beginning to catch morning light, the dew on the grass going gold and then burning off. "How many?" Lucian asked. "That I saw directly? 4. But I was kept away from that part of the house when those meetings happened, so I think more." Damon appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had a tablet in one hand and the look of a man who had found something he hadn't enjoyed finding. "The financial structure is clearer than I expected," he said, coming in and setting the tablet on the table between them. "The foundation routes money through 3 subsidiary organizations, 2 of which are registered overseas. The third is domestic and looks legitimate on the surface. It's a youth transition program, housing support for aged-out foster kids. But when you look at the actual disbursements against the stated program costs, there's about $4 million a year that doesn't correspond to any documented service or placement. Trafficking revenue laundered through a youth welfare fund," Lucian said. "That's what it looks like." Rowan looked at the numbers on the tablet. She'd known the shape of it for years. Seeing it laid out in columns and figures didn't make it feel more real. It had always been real, but it made it feel different, documented, actual, like something that could exist outside her own memory and her own word. "They have political protection," she said. "Elias has been cultivating it for years. The representative they went to first. He's not the only one. There's a city councilman. There's a federal contact I only ever heard referenced by a first name." She paused. "The narrative they're running about Lucian kidnapping me isn't just about getting me back. It's about discrediting anything I might say." Damon and Lucian exchanged a look across the table. "There's more," Damon said. He reached past Rowan and scrolled to another page on the tablet. 3 years ago, a woman named Carla DeSoto filed a report with the State Child Welfare Office. She alleged that 2 children who had been in the Hale Foundation's transitional housing program had gone missing, officially discharged to a placement that didn't exist. "What happened to the report?" Lucian asked. "It was reviewed by a caseworker and closed within 2 weeks. Insufficient evidence." Damon's voice was flat. "The caseworker retired 8 months later. She's living in Florida now. But there's a note attached to the file from the reviewing supervisor and that supervisor was appointed to his position 2 months after attending a fundraiser hosted by Elias Hale. Rowan felt the familiar cold settle into the center of her chest. The cold she'd been carrying since she was 6 years old, the one she'd learned to breathe around, work around, sleep around. She'd built her entire life in the shape of that cold space, moving around it, accommodating it. "Where is Carla de Soto now?" she asked. Damon hesitated. "Damon," Lucian said, "she died 14 months ago. It was ruled an accident." He didn't elaborate on the type of accident. He didn't need to. The cold in Rowan's chest got colder. She pushed her chair back from the table and stood up, walked to the window over the sink and looked out at the grounds. Her hands were on the edge of the counter. She could feel the edge of it, the hard ceramic, and she pressed her fingers against it deliberately. "They know I know," she said. "That's the real problem. The kidnapping story isn't about getting me back for—" She stopped herself. "It's not about them wanting me back. It's about making sure that if I talk, I look like an unstable person who was manipulated by a criminal. And if I disappear, it looks like Lucian did it." "That's the architecture," Damon confirmed. "So the longer this takes, the more credible it gets." She turned from the window. "What do we have that's documented? What can we actually use?" "The financial structure," Damon said. "It's solid. It'll hold up to forensic accounting. The problem is getting it in front of someone who isn't already in the Hale's orbit." "Federal," Lucian said. "It crosses state lines and it involves trafficking. That's federal jurisdiction. The Hales' local contacts don't have reach there." "Do you?" Rowan asked him directly. He looked at her. "Not through channels I'd prefer to use for this, but I know someone who might." "Who?" "A federal investigator. She's been building a case against a trafficking network for 3 years. The Hale Foundation isn't her current target, but if the financial links I think exist are real, it connects." "How do you know her?" A pause. The kind of pause that had its own shape. "She spent 2 years investigating me," Lucien said. "We reached an arrangement." Rowan absorbed that. "You trust her?" "I trust that she wants what's in those files more than she wants to cause me problems." "That's not the same as trust." "No," he agreed. "But right now it's what we have." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Petra appeared in the kitchen doorway. The expression on her face was the specific expression of someone delivering news they had hoped not to deliver. "We have a problem," she said. "It's Hale." The statement he gave to the press this morning. It's not just the kidnapping claim anymore. He's named the organization. She looked at Lucian. "He's alleging that you have a record of coercing vulnerable women and that Rowan is one of several. He has a supporting statement from a woman named—" She checked her phone. "Denise Para. She claims to have worked in your household 4 years ago and that she was held against her will." The room was very quiet. "I've never had a housekeeper named Denise Para," Lucian said. "I know," Petra said. "I've already pulled the employment records, but the statement exists and it's going to media this afternoon." Rowan watched Lucian's face. There was a moment, brief, controlled, where something genuinely angry moved across it, and then it was gone, and what replaced it was the expression she was beginning to recognize as his working face, contained, calculating, moving 2 steps ahead. "How long until it runs?" he asked. "The afternoon cycle. 3 hours, maybe 4. "Then we have 3 hours." He looked at Rowan. "I need you to go on record, formally, a statement dated today with your signature, your testimony about the Hale household. It won't be enough by itself to stop the narrative, but it creates a counter-record, something that exists before their story lands." Rowan didn't answer immediately, not because she was afraid to speak. She'd made her decision about that. But because she was thinking about what it meant, formally, documented, her name attached to it, and in the world in a way it couldn't be retracted from. She'd been invisible for 24 years. She'd been careful. She'd been quiet. She'd survived by being someone people could look past. This was the opposite of that. "I need paper," she said, "and I need to do it now." Damon was already moving toward the study. She sat at the desk in Lucian's study 40 minutes later with 3 pages of handwritten testimony in front of her, Damon across the desk with a recorder running, and Lucien standing at the window with his back to the room. She'd written it the way she'd kept things in her head for years, chronological, specific, with dates where she had them and approximate time frames where she didn't, and names for everyone she could name. The girl she'd seen at 15 was in there. Carla DeSoto was in there. The man with the watch who had come to the house. The hospital visit when she was 21. She signed her name at the bottom and her hand was steady. "This needs to go to the federal investigator today," she said. "It will," Lucian said. "If the afternoon media cycle hits before she sees it, she'll see it in the next hour." He turned from the window. "I called her when Petra was still in the doorway." Rowan looked at him. "You moved fast. You said you wanted to be part of deciding what comes next." A pause. "I'm trying to move fast enough that there are still decisions available to make." She nodded. Looked down at the 3 pages with her signature at the bottom. Thought about the version of herself that had been in this house 11 days ago, dropping to her knees to pick up broken glass with bleeding hands, rehearsed and efficient and carefully invisible. She looked nothing like that woman right now. She felt nothing like her either. The phone on the desk rang. A landline, which almost nothing came through anymore. Lucian crossed the room and picked it up in 2 strides, which meant he'd been expecting it or something like it. He listened for 40 seconds. His expression didn't change. He said 3 words. "How many exits?" And listened again and then said, "Hold them there," and set the phone down. Rowan was already watching him. "The federal investigator," he said. "She received the files. She's been building toward the Hales from a different direction for longer than we knew. The links Damon found aren't new to her." He paused. "She wants to meet. In person. Tonight." "With you?" Rowan asked. "With both of us." He held her gaze. "She wants your testimony in person. And she wants to go over the financial records together. She says if we can connect 3 data points she's been missing, she has enough for a warrant." Rowan stood from the desk. She straightened the 3 pages of testimony and set them flat and looked at her own signature for a moment. "3 data points," she said. "Yes." "I know what they are," she said quietly. "I've known for years." She looked up. "The overseas account in the subsidiary. There's a name attached to it. A real one, not a shell. Elias used it once in a phone call when he didn't know I was in the next room. I wrote it down and I've been carrying it since I was 20. Damon stared at her. "Why didn't you tell us that yesterday?" Lucian asked. Rowan looked at him with an expression that held 4 years of sleeping, with that name written on a piece of paper folded into the lining of a bag, of moving that bag from place to place, of carrying the one thing she had that she knew mattered, and not being able to use it because there was no one she trusted enough not to use it against her. "Because I needed to know whether this was real," she said. "I told you that." He held her gaze for a long moment. "And now?" he asked. She reached for her jacket from the back of the chair, picked it up, said the name she had been carrying for 4 years, flat and clear, the way you say something when you are finally, irrevocably done with carrying it alone. Damon's hands moved immediately to his keyboard. Lucien's expression did something that in another man might have looked like awe. But outside, 3 blocks from the estate's east gate, a black car had been parked since early morning, and the man behind the wheel had not been sent by the Hales. He had been sent by the name Rowan had just said out loud for the first time, and he had been listening. Damon's fingers had stopped moving on the keyboard the second she said it. Not a pause, a stop, the kind that happens when something you type returns a result you weren't prepared for. He stared at the screen for 3 seconds longer than anything should have required, and then he turned the laptop around so Lucian could see it. Lucian looked at the screen. His face did nothing. That was how Rowan knew it was bad. "You know that name," she said. Lucian didn't answer immediately. He looked at the screen for another second and then closed the laptop with a deliberate quietness that was more unsettling than if he'd slammed it. "Aldrich Vane runs a private equity structure out of 3 jurisdictions," he said. "He's also been a peripheral figure in a money laundering investigation that federal authorities have been building for approximately 4 years. A pause. "He is not peripheral to me. We have done business." Rowan felt the floor shift under her without moving. "What kind of business?" she said. It wasn't a question. The kind that was legitimate on my end and that I had no reason at the time to examine more closely. His jaw was tight. I was introduced to him through a mutual contact 7 years ago. We moved money through a shared financial structure on 2 occasions. Both were documented, both were above board for my position. He looked at her. I didn't know what else his structures were being used for. But if the federal investigator pulls that connection, it complicates the picture significantly. He said it with the flatness of someone delivering a damage assessment, not making an excuse. It doesn't make me complicit in what Vane does, but it makes the story easier to distort, and right now the Hales are already working to distort it. Rowan stood very still. She'd spent 4 years carrying that name like a weapon she was saving, like the one thing she had that was clean and useful and hers. And in 30 seconds it had become a liability attached to the only person standing between her and the people who wanted her back. "Does the investigator know?" she asked. "About your connection to Vane?" Lucien looked at Damon. "She's been building the case for 3 years, Damon said carefully. "If she's as thorough as you've described, she knows." "Then she already knew when she agreed to meet tonight," Rowan said. "Which means she's not just meeting to collect testimony, she's meeting to see what we do with it." Silence. "You're being tested," Rowan said. Lucien looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize, something between acknowledgement and something harder underneath. "Then we go anyway," he said. "With everything." With everything, Rowan picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. Her hands were steady. She didn't understand why they were steady. The rest of her felt like glass that had been tapped in exactly the right place, the structural integrity technically intact, but the fracture line visible if you knew where to look. But her hands were steady, and she was going to use that. "There's one more thing," she said. "The car." Lucien looked at her. "The black car 3 blocks east. Petra mentioned it when she came in. I saw her look at her phone right before she told you about the press statement. She knows about the car." Petra was still in the doorway. She hadn't moved. Rowan looked at her and Petra looked back, and the look that passed between them had the particular quality of 2 women assessing each other with total honesty. "How long has it been there?" Lucien asked Petra. "Since approximately 6 this morning," Petra said. "I didn't mention it because I was trying to determine whether it was surveillance or something else. And now? Now I think it's something else." Petra set her phone face down on the doorframe. "The driver changed twice. The car didn't move. Surveillance teams rotate the car, not just the driver." "Vane," Damon said, "or someone working for him who heard what they needed to hear and is waiting to confirm it." Petra's voice was measured, professional, the voice of someone who had run this kind of calculation before and didn't enjoy it. "If Rowan said that name aloud in this room, and the room was compromised before this morning, it wasn't compromised this morning," Lucien said. "Joel gave them a layout. He didn't have access to the study. Then Vane's people are operating on something else." Petra picked her phone back up. "Which means someone else in this chain has been talking to them." The study went quiet in the specific way that a room goes quiet when everyone in it is running the same calculation and nobody wants to be the first to name what the calculation points to. Rowan was the one who named it. "The federal investigator," she said. "When did Lucien call her?" Damon answered before Lucien could. "Approximately 40 minutes ago." "And the car was there since 6 this morning." Rowan looked at Lucien. "Before you called her. Before I said the name." "She's been investigating Vane for 3 years," Lucien said slowly, "which means she knows his people and his methods." Rowan kept her voice flat because the alternative was something she couldn't afford right now. "And she agreed to meet tonight very quickly for someone who had to absorb that much new information." The silence this time was different, heavier. "I need her name," Rowan said. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. "Calloway. Investigator Dana Calloway, Financial Crimes Division." Damon was already typing. What came back took 90 seconds and landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Damon read it without inflection, which was its own kind of mercy. "Calloway has been on the Vane investigation for 3 years. 18 months ago, there was an internal review of her case files. It was closed without findings. 6 months ago, she purchased a property in a coastal area. The purchase price was approximately $400,000, above what her federal salary and documented assets would support. He paused. The financing came through a holding company. He turned the screen so they could see the name of the holding company. It was one of Vane's subsidiary structures, one of the three that Damon had identified that morning in the Hale Foundation's financial architecture. Rowan sat down, not because her legs gave, they didn't, but because standing felt suddenly like a performance she didn't have the bandwidth for. She sat in the chair in front of the desk and put both hands flat on the desk surface and looked at them. The scar on her right hand, the finger that had healed crooked. She had said Vane's name to people she trusted. Calloway had known Vane for 3 years. The meeting tonight wasn't a meeting, it was an extraction point. "She's going to give us to him," Rowan said. Her voice came out very quiet. "That's what tonight is. She collects us. She collects the testimony and the financial records. She hands everything to Vane, and the Hales get their problem resolved, and Vane gets confirmation that his name has been said out loud and by whom. And Calloway gets the rest of her mortgage covered," Damon said. Lucian had his phone out. He was already dialing. "Who are you calling?" Rowan asked. "Canceling the meeting." "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "If you cancel, they know we know. And if they know we know, everything moves faster, and we lose the one advantage we have, which is that they think tonight is still happening on their terms." She held his gaze. "We go to the meeting, we just go differently than they're expecting." "Rowan, I've spent 24 years in rooms with people who thought they controlled the situation." Her voice didn't shake. "I know how to be in a room like that. Do you have someone who isn't Calloway? Someone federal who isn't in this chain?" Lucian and Damon exchanged a look. "There's an agent," Damon said slowly, "Marcus Webb. He's been working organized crime for 12 years, different division from Calloway. There's no intersection between his cases and Vane's financial structure as far as we can tell." "How do you know him?" Rowan asked Lucian. "He investigated me 6 years ago." A beat. "Different from Calloway. He didn't reach an arrangement. He just ran out of what he needed to move forward." "Is he honest?" The words sat in the room with an almost physical weight. "As far as I can tell," Lucian said. "Yes." "Then we contact him. Not through any channel that touches Calloway's network. We give him the financial files and the testimony before the meeting tonight. Everything, including Calloway's property purchase and the holding company." Rowan pressed both palms flat on the desk. "We walk into that meeting with Calloway, knowing it's a trap, and we make sure that by the time it springs, it catches the people who said it." Damon was already pulling Webb's contact information. Lucian hadn't moved. He was looking at Rowan with an expression she'd seen only once before. That first night, crouching on the floor over the broken glass, the look that had preceded the handkerchief. "You planned this fast," he said. "I planned it for 4 years," she said. "I just didn't have anyone to plan it with." The afternoon burned down fast after that. Webb was contacted through a channel so indirect it involved 3 intermediaries and a meeting point that was a parking structure on the south side of the city, 2 levels underground. Lucy Mantzien went in person. Rowan stayed at the estate with Damon and Petra and a security configuration that Petra had redesigned from scratch after the breach, moving Rowan to a different wing entirely and running the exterior cameras on a rotation pattern that couldn't be predicted from outside. She used the 3 hours to go through the financial files with Damon, identifying the 3 data points she'd held for 4 years and mapping them against the broader structure he'd built. They fit. Of course they fit. She'd always known they would, had known it the way you know things you've lived inside of, with a certainty that doesn't require documentation because you've watched it operate up close. But seeing them fit in the documented record, seeing the structure become visible and named and real, was a different experience than knowing. She didn't cry. She thought she might. She didn't. She wrote a supplementary page of testimony, added it to the 3 from the morning, and signed it with the same steady hand. Lucien came back at 4 in the afternoon. He sat across from her in the kitchen. They kept ending up in the kitchen, she noticed, which was maybe because it was the most neutral room in the house, the least weighted with the particular atmosphere of the rest of the estate, and told her what Webb had said. Webb had listened without speaking for almost the entire meeting. He'd taken the files. He'd looked at the Calloway property documentation for a long time without expression. Then he'd asked one question, How fast could they move tonight, and what did they need from him? Lucien told him. Webb had said he'd need 2 hours to build something that would hold in court. 2 hours is exactly how long until the meeting with Calloway, Rowan said. I know. So we either trust that he moves fast enough, or we stall the meeting. Lucien looked at her. Calloway won't wait more than 40 minutes past the scheduled time before she assumes we've run. Then we don't stall. We go on schedule. Rowan looked down at the table. She doesn't know what we gave Webb. She thinks she's holding the only copy of everything. She thinks tonight is a handover. So we hand something over. Rowan looked up. Not the real files. A version. Enough to look like everything. Enough to buy Webb the time he needs. Damon from the doorway. I can build that in an hour. Build it, Lucien said. The meeting was set for a converted loft space on the north side. Calloway's choice, which made sense now. Neutral on the surface, private enough to manage an outcome that couldn't be managed in a public space. Rowan changed into dark clothes without thinking about it, the same automatic efficiency she'd used to dress for work every morning for years. She clipped her hair back. She looked at herself in the mirror in the spare room where she'd been moved and felt the particular sensation of seeing someone she didn't entirely recognize, or rather, of seeing someone she recognized as a version of herself she'd only ever caught in peripheral glimpses. Petra met her in the corridor with a jacket that had an inside pocket. The pocket's reinforced, Petra said, for the documents. A pause. And for a recording device. Rowan looked at her. The device will transmit in real time to Damon and to Webb's team. Petra held the jacket out. You don't have to. Lucien will be in the room with you. Rowan took the jacket. I know. She put it on. The inside pocket sat flat against her ribs. You've done something like this before, Rowan said to Petra. It wasn't a question. Petra looked at her with the expression of someone who has been asked a question they've decided to answer truthfully. Once, a long time ago, different circumstances. How did it go? It went the way it had to. Petra straightened the collar of the jacket with 2 brief, efficient movements. Which was not the way I wanted it to. Rowan absorbed that. Thank you, she said. She meant it in a larger sense than just the jacket, and Petra seemed to understand that. The drive to the north side took 22 minutes. Lucien drove himself, which Rowan had not expected. She sat in the passenger seat and watched the city move past the windows, and thought about the version of this night where Calloway was exactly what she'd presented herself to be. Where the meeting was what it appeared to be. Where the name she'd carried for 4 years was simply information and not the thing that had put them in the middle of something larger and more connected than either of them had understood. She thought about it for about 40 seconds, and then put it away. The loft building had an exterior entrance on the east side. Calloway was already there when they arrived. Rowan registered that immediately, the way she registered all spatial information now, mapping who was where and what it meant. Calloway was early. That was meaningful. A person running a legitimate meeting was on time. A person managing a timeline they needed to control arrived early. Calloway was 45, with the particular professional composure of someone who had spent years in rooms that required it. She shook Lucien's hand. She looked at Rowan with an assessment so brief and practiced it would have been invisible to someone not trained to see it. Rowan smiled at her. She'd practiced a version of this smile for 24 years, present, compliant, communicating nothing. They went upstairs. The loft was open plan, the kind of space that felt neutral by design. A table, chairs, a window on the west side that Rowan clocked immediately as overlooking an alley. 2 other people were already in the room. Calloway introduced them as colleagues, gave first names only, and Rowan noted the positioning. 1 near the door, 1 near the window. Not colleagues. I appreciate you both coming, Calloway said. She sat across the table from them and opened a folder with the practiced ease of a professional at work. I've reviewed the preliminary material Damon Reyes sent over. It's significant. We have more, Lucien said. I assumed. She looked at Rowan. I'd like to hear it in your words, before we look at the documents. Rowan had expected this. It was the right move if you needed to assess what the subject actually knew versus what they'd been told to say. You stripped away the documents and made them produce it from memory, and the gaps and hesitations told you more than the documents did. She gave Calloway her testimony. Everything from the morning's written account and more. She added context. She added detail. She talked for 11 minutes without stopping and kept her voice level and her eyes on Calloway's face the whole time. Calloway took notes. She was good at it. Her expression stayed open and professionally engaged, the expression of someone building a case. Then Rowan said, without changing her tone or her pace, "I'd also like to talk about Aldrich Vane, specifically the holding company that financed a coastal property purchase approximately 6 months ago." The room changed, not visibly. Nothing moved. Calloway's pen didn't stop. The man by the door didn't shift his weight, but the room changed. Calloway looked up from her notes. The professional engagement was still there on her face, and underneath it, now visible if you knew what you were looking for, was something that was doing a rapid and complex calculation. "That's a significant allegation," Calloway said. "I'm not making an allegation," Rowan said. "I'm citing documented financial records. The documentation is with a federal agent in a different division who has been in possession of it since 3 o'clock this afternoon." The pen stopped. "His name is Marcus Webb," Rowan said. "He has everything, including this conversation which is being transmitted in real time." She held Calloway's gaze across the table. "I've spent 24 years with people who thought they controlled the room I was sitting in. You're going to need to think of something better than this." The man by the door moved. Lucien was already standing. What happened in the next 40 seconds was fast and not clean, and afterward Rowan's ears rang from the sound of the door hitting the wall, and her own heartbeat was very loud. The man near the window hadn't moved, had gone very still instead, hands visible, which meant he was smarter than the one by the door or had a better read on how the odds had shifted. Calloway sat at the table. She hadn't moved. She was looking at Rowan with an expression that had finally dropped the professional layer and showed what was underneath, which was the particular look of someone who had made a series of decisions they could no longer walk back from and was only now understanding the full cost. Rowan recognized that look. She'd seen it in her own mirror for years. She didn't feel sorry for her. "The records Webb has," Calloway said. Her voice had changed, smaller now, more actual. "They'll go to his supervisors tonight." Rowan kept her voice even. "Along with the Hale Foundation files and my complete testimony and the financial connection between Vane's structure and the Foundation and the documented evidence of 3 years of case files being managed in a direction that served Vane's interests." She paused. "It's already in motion. There's nothing here that stops it." Calloway set her pen down on the table. From outside, Rowan heard vehicles. The particular sound of multiple vehicles arriving in coordination, unhurried, the sound of people who knew they had time because the timeline was already secured. Webb's team. Lucien looked at Rowan across the table. Something passed between them that didn't need language. The specific recognition of 2 people who have been in a burning building and made it out the same door. And then Calloway said something that stopped the room. "Vane knows about Webb," she said. Her voice was flat and exhausted and stripped of everything except the particular urgency of someone trying to spend the only currency they had left. "He's known since 2 o'clock. He has a secondary contact inside Webb's division. Whatever Webb has, Vane knows about it. And he's not going to wait for a warrant." She looked at Rowan. "He's going to move tonight, not against Lucien, against the records themselves." A pause. "And against you." The sound of Webb's vehicles outside. The weight of what Calloway had just said settling into the room like a temperature drop. Rowan looked at Lucien. The plan they had built in 12 hours. The testimony, the documents, the transmission, Webb's team arriving at this exact moment was not the end of it. It was the middle. And the middle was crumbling in real time because somewhere in the chain they had trusted, another link had already. Rowan didn't wait for her to find it. "Where are the records stored?" she said. "The originals. Webb's copies." Calloway looked at her with the expression of someone calculating what cooperation was worth at this precise moment. It was a fast calculation. The vehicles outside, Lucien standing, the man by the window with his hand still visible, and it resolved faster than Rowan expected. "Federal building on Crane Street," Calloway said. "Webb's division uses the 4th floor evidence room. The secondary contact is an administrative processor named Holt. He has overnight access clearance. How long has Vane known? Since 2, maybe earlier. Lucian already had his phone out. He stepped away from the table, speaking low and fast. Rowan kept her eyes on Calloway. Who else? Rowan said. In Webb's division. Who else is Vane's? I don't know. That's not an answer? It's the only one I have. Calloway's voice cracked slightly on the last word. Not emotion exactly, more the sound of a structure under load. Vane doesn't share architecture. He gives people what they need to do their specific job and nothing else. I didn't know about Holt until 40 minutes ago when Vane told me the timeline had changed. Vane called you. Yes. When? While you were in the car. She held Rowan's gaze. He told me the meeting parameters had changed, that I was to delay you here as long as possible. Rowan absorbed that. The transmission had been running since they arrived. Webb's team was outside. The records on Crane Street were potentially being walked out of a federal building by a man named Holt, while they sat in this room. The transmission, Rowan said, loud enough for Lucian to hear across the room. Does Webb have a copy off-site? Anything that isn't on Crane Street? Lucian turned, spoke into the phone, listened. His jaw tightened. Everything went to Crane Street. It was the secure location. Call him, right now. Tell him about Holt. Lucian was already doing it. Rowan stood from the table. She looked at the man by the window. You. Do you have a car outside? He looked at her with the careful blankness of someone deciding whether the situation had changed enough to revise their positioning. Then he looked at where his colleague was on the floor near the door, Lucien's security having handled that problem with efficient unpleasantness, and he said, yes. Faster than the vehicles outside? Depends where you're going. Crane Street Federal Building, 4th floor. He looked at her for one more second, then, get in the elevator when we arrive and don't wait for me. She looked at Lucian. He was still on the phone, moving toward the door, and he met her eyes across the room, and something passed between them again. The same look as before, the burning building look, but with an additional quality now that she didn't have words for and didn't need them. Go, he said. Into the phone and at her simultaneously. She went. The car was faster, not comfortable fast, the kind of fast that pressed her back into the seat and made the city outside the window become a smear of light and dark, the driver running 2 red signals with the particular efficiency of someone who had done this before and was calculating risk in real time rather than following rules designed for people who had more time. Rowan sat in the passenger seat with both hands flat on her thighs and watched the route and breathed. Her heartbeat was very loud. She focused on keeping it countable. 4 minutes, the driver said. His name was apparently not something he planned to share. Is there a back entrance to the building? Loading dock on the south side. Access requires a key card. Does Vane's people know about it? If Holt knows about it, Vane knows about it. Then we use the front. There are cameras in the lobby. Good, she said. I want to be on camera. He looked at her sideways. If something happens to us inside that building, I want documentation of when we were there, she said. And I want anyone watching those cameras to know we were there before anything happened to the records. He drove without responding. She took it as agreement. The federal building on Crane Street was a mid-rise with a glass lobby that sat between 2 older stone structures, bureaucratic and undistinguished, the kind of building designed to function rather than to impress. At 11 at night, it had the skeleton crew quality of institutional buildings after hours. A security guard at the lobby desk, the overhead lights at half power, the particular silence of a building that contained important things and knew it. Rowan pushed through the front door. The lobby camera was above and to her left. She didn't look at it directly. Looking at cameras directly made footage look staged. But she positioned herself in its sight line as she crossed to the desk. The guard was 40, tired. The specific tiredness of someone 3 hours into a quiet overnight shift. He looked at her with the mild suspicion appropriate to an unknown woman entering a federal building at 11 p.m. I need to reach Agent Marcus Webb, she said. My name is Rowan Hale. He's expecting me. The guard reached for his phone. Rowan watched the elevator bank on the far wall. The floor indicator above the left elevator was moving. It was on 3, moving to 4. Sir, she said, keeping her voice controlled. This is urgent. Someone is accessing the fourth floor evidence room right now who shouldn't be there. I need you to call Webb directly, and I need building security to get to 4 immediately. The guard looked at her. She put both hands on the desk. Let him see them. The scar on the right hand, the crooked finger, all of it. Not as a manipulation. She didn't have time for manipulation. But because her hands were the most honest thing about her, and she needed him to understand in the next 10 seconds that she was not performing urgency. He picked up the radio instead of the phone. While he was talking into it, the elevator on the left reached 4 and stopped. She moved to the elevator bank and hit the call button. The right elevator was on 2. She hit the button again. Pointless, but her hand needed somewhere to go. Her heartbeat was at the edge of countable now. She pulled it back, breathed through her nose, made herself stand still. The right elevator opened. She got in. 4th floor was a corridor that ran the width of the building, fluorescent lighting 1 shade too bright, the smell of institutional carpet and recycled air. The evidence room was behind a coated door on the left side. She knew this from what Webb had told Lucien in the parking structure, which Lucien had told her in the car on the way to meet Calloway, which felt like a different era of the evening. The coated door was open. Not breached, open. The kind of open that meant someone with a valid code had entered and not pulled it fully closed behind them. She pushed it. The evidence room was long and narrow, shelving units on both sides. The kind of institutional organization that made things findable and also made it immediately obvious when something was missing. She could see the gap from the doorway. A section of the middle shelving unit, eye level, where a series of labeled folders and 2 external drives had been pulled and not replaced. A man was at the far end of the room with a bag. He was fast. She registered that immediately. The practiced efficiency of someone doing something they'd rehearsed, moving without looking, hands going to the right places without hesitation. He hadn't heard her. The ventilation in the room was loud enough. She thought about calling out. Assessed it in under a second. If she called out, he'd run, and the door at the far end was a fire exit, and she didn't know what was on the other side of it. She crossed the room. He heard her at 6 feet. Turned fast. Younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, the bureaucratic invisibility of someone who had built a career on being easy to overlook. His name was apparently Holt, and he had a bag containing everything that could put Aldrich Vane in a federal courtroom. And he looked at her with the expression of someone who had prepared for several scenarios, and this specific one wasn't among them. "Put the bag down," she said. He ran for the fire exit. She was closer to it than he'd calculated. What happened was not elegant, and she would not remember all of it cleanly. Her body made decisions faster than her brain filed them. The impact of the door hitting his shoulder as she got her arm through the gap before it could open fully, the particular desperate strength of someone who needed something badly enough to stop thinking and just need it. He was larger than her and had the bag and had momentum, and she had the angle on the door and the specific knowledge of what was inside the bag and what its absence meant. He hit the door hard. She held the gap. He turned and shoved her with his free hand, and she went back 2 steps into the shelving, the metal edge catching her across the shoulder blades with a pain that was immediate and clarifying. She grabbed his arm. Not his wrist. His arm, above the elbow, and she used the shelving behind her as a brace and pulled. And the physics of it weren't in her favor, but the angle was. And when his knee hit the floor, the bag went with him, and she got her hand on the strap. He still had it. She still had the strap. They were both on the floor between the shelving units, and the fluorescent light above was very bright, and her shoulder was screaming, and she could hear his breathing, ragged and fast, the breathing of someone who had not planned to be on the floor of an evidence room at 11 p.m. "Let go," he said. "No." He pulled. She didn't let go. She wrapped the strap around her wrist, and when he pulled again, it pulled her forward, and she used that, let the momentum carry her weight forward into him, which was a choice that involved her taking his elbow to the cheekbone and seeing a brief white moment, but also meant that his center of gravity went backward and the hand holding the bag hit the floor. She got the bag. She was on her feet before he was. The fire door opened from the other side. She spun, bag against her chest, and the man coming through the fire door was not Holt's backup. He was Webb's, badge in one hand, the other held out and open, and behind him 2 more people with the particular configuration of federal agents moving fast through a door they'd been told to move fast through. Holt was on the floor. Rowan was standing with a bag of evidence against her chest and blood running down the side of her face from where his elbow had caught her, and her shoulder felt like something in it had been rearranged into a position it didn't prefer. Webb was the 3rd one through the door. He took in the room in 2 seconds. Holt on the floor, Rowan standing, the bag, and looked at her with an expression that was professionally composed over something that was not entirely composed. "You're bleeding," he said. "The records are in the bag," she said. "All of it." "Are you—" "I'm fine. Is Lucian—" "He's downstairs." Webb moved past her to Holt, who was being handled with the efficient impersonality of people who did this regularly. His people intercepted a second team Vane had sent to the loft building. Everyone's accounted for. Rowan lowered the bag, held it for a second longer, and then held it out to Webb, who took it with both hands. "Calloway," she said, "in federal custody as of 20 minutes ago. Her administrative access was suspended at the same time." He looked at her. "She cooperated, gave us Holt's name." "I know. I got here anyway." He looked at her with the expression of a man revising an assessment. "I see that." She walked out of the evidence room. Her shoulder was sending detailed complaints with every step, and she ignored them with the long practice of someone who had been ignoring what her body reported for years. The corridor outside was now populated with people who hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. Building security, 2 of Webb's people, a woman with a medical kit who fell into step beside her immediately. Rowan stopped her. "In a minute." She needed 1 minute first. She stood in the corridor under the fluorescent lights with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling and breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The things she'd done since she was 7 years old in small places when the walls felt like they were closing, except this time the walls were not closing. This time the corridor was wide and the door at the end of it was open. She'd said the name she'd been carrying for 4 years, and it had almost gotten everything destroyed, and she'd walked into a trap, knowing it was a trap, and she'd sat across from a woman who was paid to hand her over and spoken with a steady voice, and she'd run through a federal building and gotten to a door in time and held a bag against her chest on the floor of an evidence room and not let go. Her cheekbone throbbed. Her shoulder was going to be worse tomorrow. She breathed. Her phone rang. She answered it without looking at the screen because she knew whose it was. "I'm on the 4th floor," she said. "Records are with Webb. Holt is in custody." Lucian's voice came back. She could hear the particular quality of outdoor air behind it. He was outside, moving. "Are you hurt?" "Some." A pause. "I'm okay." A silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, the kind that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to fill it yet. "The Hales," she said. "Webb has everything now. The foundation records, the financial structure, the testimony. Calloway's cooperation gives him the connection to Vane." "I know." "How long?" "Webb says warrants by morning." A pause. "He wants you in a formal interview at 6 a.m. She looked at the ceiling. 6 a.m. was 5 hours away. Her shoulder was building towards something she was going to have to deal with before 6 a.m. "Okay." "Rowan." "Yeah." Another silence. Longer this time. "I'm coming to get you," he said. She didn't answer for a moment. Listened to the sound of the building around her. The ventilation, the footsteps, the professional movement of people doing things that needed doing. All of it was loud and real and present and here. "I know," she said. She ended the call and let the medical woman look at her cheek and her shoulder and stood in the corridor while it happened and thought about the name she'd carried for 4 years and the bag she'd held on the floor and the door that had been open at the end of a hallway. Downstairs in the lobby, the front entrance opened. Lucien came through it with the particular pace of a man who has been moving fast for several hours and has arrived where he needed to arrive. He crossed the lobby without stopping, hit the elevator call, looked up at the floor indicator the same way she had 40 minutes ago. He didn't know yet that she was watching him from the top of the stairs. She watched him for 3 seconds. This man who had crouched down on a marble floor to look at her hands, who had said good when she said she wasn't going back, who had driven himself to the meeting instead of sending people, who had said go simultaneously into his phone and at her, and meant both, and felt something shift inside her chest that was not the cold thing that had lived there since she was 6. It was something else, something that didn't have a name she trusted yet, but that was taking up exactly the space the cold thing had vacated. The elevator opened. She took the stairs instead. She was at the bottom when he turned and saw her, and he stopped completely, the particular stop of a person whose body makes the decision before the brain catches up, and she crossed the lobby toward him. And when she was close enough she could see his face clearly, she saw the thing he was not saying, and she understood it, and she held his gaze and said, "The morning. We do the interview, and we give Webb everything, and we watch it go." He looked at her face, the blood on her cheek that the medical woman had cleaned but not yet closed, the way she was holding her left shoulder slightly higher than the right. "And after the morning," he said. She held his gaze. "After the morning," she said, "I want to go home." The word came out right this time. It came out with warmth inside it. He looked at her for one more second, and then he nodded, once, and she fell into step beside him, and they walked toward the door together. While above them on the 4th floor, Webb's people cataloged everything in the bag she had held on the floor and would not let go of. And across the city in a house that had functioned for years as something that wore the word home as a mask, Elias and Vivian Hale were about to receive a phone call that would be the last quiet moment. He was in the study of the house on Mercer Hill, the good study, the one with the mahogany desk and the framed photographs of foundation galas and the shelf of awards from organizations that had taken his money and given him legitimacy in return. He was on his second drink and reviewing a draft statement his attorney had prepared for the morning news cycle, the one that would deepen the kidnapping narrative and include a carefully worded suggestion that Rowan's mental history made her testimony inherently unreliable. He answered on the second ring because he was expecting Calloway. It was not Calloway. It was a federal agent named Webb who identified himself with badge number and division and informed Elias in a voice of complete professional neutrality that a warrant for his arrest had been issued and that agents would be arriving at the Mercer Hill property within the hour and that he had the right to contact his attorney before that arrival. Elias sat with the phone against his ear for 4 seconds after Webb finished speaking. Then he said, "You have the wrong person," and ended the call. He sat at the mahogany desk for another 30 seconds. Then he picked up the phone again and called his attorney, who answered on the 5th ring with the voice of someone pulled from sleep, and Elias said, "They're coming tonight." And his attorney said nothing for a moment and then said, "Don't say anything else on this line," and ended the call. Elias set the phone down on the desk next to the draft statement. Vivian appeared in the doorway. She'd heard his voice. She always heard things. It was one of her qualities, the particular alertness of a woman who had spent decades monitoring the atmosphere of rooms for shifts in pressure. She was in her robe and her face had the stripped quality it only ever had when she hadn't yet composed it for an audience, and she looked at him across the study and said, "How bad?" He looked at the framed photographs on the shelf. 22 years of galas. 22 years of handshakes with people who mattered, of checks written to causes that made their names appear in programs, of the particular architecture of a life built to look impeccable from every angle that people with power tended to look from. "Bad," he said. She walked into the study and sat down in the chair across from the desk, the chair where donors sat, where journalists sat, where the occasional grateful foundation beneficiary sat to thank them personally. She sat in it with her hands folded in her lap and her face doing the composing, the automatic reassembly of the version of herself she presented, and then she looked at him and it fell apart and she said, "Was it the Hale girl?" He didn't answer. "Elias." "Yes," he said. It was Rowan. Vivian looked at the middle distance between them, her hands unfolded and refolded. "I told you 7 years ago that keeping her there was a mistake. I told you she was too close to things. You told me she was too frightened to speak. I was wrong." Vivian's voice came out flat and exhausted, a quality he hadn't heard from her in years because she was so rarely genuinely exhausted. She performed fatigue sometimes as a social instrument, but this was the actual thing. "I was wrong about her." The study was quiet. The house around them was quiet. The particular quality of a large house at midnight, the settling sounds, the climate control cycling, the absence of staff at this hour. A house that had functioned as a stage set for 22 years, now sitting in silence while the mechanism that had kept the performance running was being dismantled floor by floor somewhere across the city. The foundation, Vivian said. Everything? Everything. She looked at her hands. Vane? Gone. I haven't been able to reach him since 10 o'clock. He said it without particular bitterness. Aldrich Vane had always been the kind of person who was present when the structure was sound and absent when it wasn't, and Elias had understood this about him and used him anyway, which was its own category of decision that he had no useful frame for examining at midnight with federal agents an hour away. Vivian stood up. She walked to the shelf with the photographs and looked at them, the way a person looks at something they're trying to memorize or trying to determine whether it's worth keeping. She reached out and touched the frame of one, a gala from 9 years ago, both of them in formal wear, the foundation's logo on a banner behind them, their faces doing the thing their faces had done at every gala for 22 years. She took the photograph off the shelf and set it face down. I'm going to call my own attorney, she said. Vivian, they're going to offer arrangements. They always offer arrangements, and whatever you decide is what you decide. But I want my own counsel before any of that happens. She turned from the shelf. Whatever Rowan told them, it's true. You know it's true. I know it's true. The only question now is what portion of it we're responsible for legally versus morally, and those are two entirely different conversations. He looked at her. You're going to cooperate. I'm going to survive, she said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an accusation. It was the most honest thing she'd said to him in years. We should have let her go the first time she tried. She left the study. He heard her on the stairs, and then her footsteps in the upper corridor, and then the sound of a door. He sat alone at the mahogany desk with the draft statement in front of him and did not move for a long time. The agents arrived at 12:53 a.m. There were 4 of them. They were professional and efficient and gave him exactly the time he needed to retrieve his jacket and tell them that his attorney was already en route to the federal processing facility. He walked out of the house on Mercer Hill without looking back at the study, which he would later understand was because he had already been looking away from it for 22 years and the habit was simply too ingrained to break in a single night. Vivian came downstairs when she heard them in the foyer. She was dressed, she'd changed from her robe in the time she'd had, and her face was the composed version, the version she'd worn at every gala, every board meeting, every doorstep conversation with the neighbors who had occasionally called with concerns that she had resolved at the door with a look and a careful word. She looked, for the last time, exactly like what she'd spent 22 years performing. Then she put her hands out and let the agents do what agents were there to do, and the performance was over. Rowan was not at Mercer Hill when they were arrested. She was at the Federal Building on Crane Street, in a conference room on the 2nd floor, with Webb across the table and a cup of coffee she was actually drinking, and 7 hours of testimony recorded in segments with breaks for her shoulder, which turned out to have a separated joint that a federal medical officer addressed with professional efficiency and an ice pack the size of a small pillow, and for food, which she ate without being asked if she was hungry, without asking permission, without standing at a counter to remain ready to move. She sat at the table and she ate and she talked, and she did not stop until Webb said they had everything they needed and it was 5:30 in the morning and the light outside the conference room window was beginning to change. Webb closed his folder. He looked at her across the table with the expression of someone who had been doing this work for 12 years and had developed a reliable instinct for the particular quality of testimony that would hold, that would survive cross-examination and defense attorneys, and the specific pressures that powerful people with resources could bring to bear on witnesses who had been frightened for a long time. You understand that this goes to trial, he said. That there will be a period, months, possibly longer, where this is ongoing. I know. And that the defense will attempt to characterize you as unstable, as manipulated, as a damaged person whose testimony is colored by her psychological history. She said it without flinching. I know. They've been building that characterization for 2 months. It's why the letter was the first move. They needed to establish the narrative before I could establish one of my own. She looked at him. But I have 3 pages of physical medical documentation, 4 years of a financial record I held in my memory and can reproduce with precision, and the testimony of a federal agent who is being paid to discredit me and whose payment came from the same structure I've been describing. She paused. And I have Vivian. Webb looked up from the folder. She's going to cooperate, Rowan said. She told Elias she would, which means she told him in a room that was likely under surveillance from the moment your warrants went through. She'll do it to survive. That's who she is. Rowan set down the coffee cup. It'll be enough. Together with everything else, it'll be enough. Webb was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this for a long time. Since I was 20, she said. Give or take. He nodded slowly. Then he said, There's one thing I need to tell you, and I'd rather you hear it from me than from another source. He opened the folder again and found a specific page. Aldrich Vane was apprehended at 3 a.m. at a private airfield outside the city. He was in the process of boarding a chartered flight with documentation under a different name. A pause. He's in federal custody. His cooperation is already being negotiated. Rowan looked at the table, the name she'd carried for 4 years, the name that had nearly destroyed the plan, that had been Calloway's leverage, that had sent a car to watch the estate before she'd even said it aloud. It was attached to a man sitting in a federal facility at 5:30 in the morning, negotiating, because that was what men like Aldrich Vane did when the structure they'd built collapsed. They negotiated with whatever they had left. His testimony will be self-serving, she said. Yes. We'll use what's useful and document the rest. And the children. Her voice dropped slightly on the 2 words, but she kept going. The ones that were moved through the foundation. The ones I know about and the ones I don't. What happens to those cases? They go to a specialized unit. It'll take time. Some of them may not be findable. He said it honestly, the way she'd come to understand he said things, directly, without buffering. But some of them will be, and the financial assets seized from the Hale Foundation and Vane's connected structures are substantial. They'll fund the investigation for as long as it needs to run. Rowan nodded. She thought about the girl who had been 15, the one who had been in the house for 3 days and left with a man with a watch. She had not stopped thinking about her in 9 years. She did not expect to stop. But she also understood that the thing she could do about her now was different from anything she'd been able to do before. The helplessness that had lived underneath the cold space in her chest was not gone. She didn't think it would ever be gone entirely, didn't think that was how those things worked, but it had shifted. It occupied a smaller territory. There was more room around it for things that were not helplessness. We're done for now, Webb said. Go home. She stood from the table. Her shoulder registered the movement, and she absorbed the information and kept moving. At the door, she stopped. The administrative processor, Holt. In custody. He was 20 minutes away from walking those records out of the building. I know. Webb looked at her. He didn't. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went. Lucien was in the lobby. He'd been there since she'd gone up to the conference room. She didn't know that until later, when Petra told her, the way Petra told most things, directly and without embellishment. He'd sat in the lobby for 7 hours while she gave testimony on the second floor, which was either a very straightforward thing or an enormous thing, and she suspected it was both simultaneously. He stood when she came off the elevator, looked at her face first and then at her shoulder and then at her face again. Elias and Vivian, she said, arrested at 1 in the morning, processing now. Vane. I know. Webb's people called. He paused. How's your shoulder? Separated. They put it back. Rowan. It's fine. It hurts, but it's fine. She looked at him in the lobby light, which was the ordinary fluorescent light of a building that existed to function. The same light as the corridor on the 4th floor, the same light as most of the spaces where the night's events had happened. He looked like someone who had been awake for a long time and was not going to admit how long. You stayed. Yes. She considered several things she might say and discarded all of them because none of them were as accurate as the simple fact of him standing in the lobby after 7 hours. Okay, she said. Let's go. They drove back as the city was beginning its morning. The particular hour when the night shift was ending and the early risers hadn't fully committed yet, the streets holding both in an uneasy truce. Rowan sat in the passenger seat and watched it and felt the exhaustion coming in now that the adrenaline had finished its work. A deep physical exhaustion that sat in every joint and behind her eyes and made the city outside the window look simultaneously very real and very far away. She fell asleep somewhere in the last 10 minutes of the drive. She didn't mean to. She was aware of being awake, and then she was aware of the car being still and Lucien saying her name quietly, and the estate gates were in front of them in the early morning light, the grounds beyond them green and wet with dew. She straightened in the seat and felt her shoulder remind her of the night's events and breathed through it. "You were out for 8 minutes," Lucien said. "Not a criticism, just information." "First time I've slept in a car in years," she said. She meant it as a factual observation, and it came out as something slightly more than that, and she didn't walk it back. Inside, Petra had coffee and breakfast on the kitchen table. Real breakfast. Eggs and toast and fruit, the kind of meal that required someone to have thought about it in advance. Rowan sat down and ate without ceremony, and Petra sat across from her with her own coffee, and they didn't talk much, which was fine. Petra was a person who understood the value of not filling silence with things that didn't belong in it. Lucien ate standing up, which she'd observed was a habit he maintained regardless of circumstances, and then excused himself to make calls, and Petra refilled Rowan's coffee without asking, and Rowan looked out the window at the kitchen garden in the early light. The rosemary had gotten leggy again. She'd meant to cut it back. She was going to cut it back today. The weeks that followed were not quiet. She hadn't expected them to be. There were additional interviews, additional documentation sessions, a meeting with a victim advocacy attorney who Rowan found practical and clear-eyed and hired on the same day. There was a preliminary hearing at which Elias Hale appeared in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly income and listened to the charges against him with the specific expression of a man who had spent decades believing the rules existed for other people and who was revising that belief in real time and finding the revision physically uncomfortable. Vivian had cooperated fully. Her testimony was detailed and given without apparent affect. The same composure she'd brought to every public appearance for 22 years now turned toward a different purpose. Rowan sat in the gallery for the preliminary hearing and watched Vivian across the room and felt the complicated things she always felt when she looked at Vivian. Not forgiveness, not hatred, but something more like the recognition of a person she had spent her entire childhood trying to read and had never fully decoded. And now that the surface was stripped back, the person underneath was smaller and more ordinary and in some ways more frightening for it. Vivian did not look at Rowan during the hearing. Elias did. Once. For approximately 3 seconds across the gallery, and the look had several things in it that Rowan took a moment to examine and then set down and did not pick up again. The financial assets were moved through the legal process with the particular speed that happens when the political protection has been removed, and the people who had provided it were occupied with managing their own exposure. The Hale Foundation's accounts were frozen and then transferred to federal oversight. The Youth Transition Program, the one with the $4 million annual gap, was shut down on a Tuesday, its files turned over to Webb's specialized unit, and the investigation into the children who had passed through it begun in earnest. In the 4th month, Rowan incorporated a nonprofit. She did it herself with the advocacy attorney and a woman named Sarah, who had come recommended through Webb's unit, a former investigator who had spent 8 years in child welfare and had the particular knowledge base that Rowan was missing and needed. They sat at the kitchen table in the estate for 3 days with documents spread across the surface and argued constructively about structure and approach and funding models. And Lucien came through twice and looked at the documents without being asked and offered one observation each time that was useful and then left them to it, which was exactly the correct level of involvement. The nonprofit was called the Sable Recovery Initiative, which was Sarah's suggestion, and it focused on survivors of institutional abuse and trafficking, providing legal advocacy, housing transitional support, and long-term psychological services funded through a combination of the seized Hale Foundation assets and a grant structure Rowan had spent 6 weeks building with the advocacy attorney. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. The need was a scale she couldn't meet with what she had, but it was something that had not existed before. and the girl who had been 15 and left with a man with a watch had not had anything that existed before. And Rowan understood that you built what you could build, and you did not apologize for its edges. She moved the rosemary in the kitchen garden, cut it back, gave it better light, put in lavender at the base of the south wall where the drainage was better. She did it on a Saturday morning in the 6th month, hands in the soil, her shoulder doing fine now, healed correctly, unlike her fingers, the physical therapy having worked in a way that things set properly tended to work. She'd done 3 months of it. She'd gone every appointment without being told to. That was still new, doing things because they were good for her, without anyone requiring it. She was still learning the shape of it. Lucien found her in the garden at noon. He brought his own coffee and sat on the low stone wall at the garden's edge and watched her work without narrating it, which was one of his qualities she had come to rely on more than she'd expected. His comfort with being present without filling the space up. He was a man who had spent years understanding that silence in a room could be controlled just as effectively as sound, and had apparently discovered at some point that the same principle applied to less strategic contexts. "Webb called," he said eventually. Rowan sat back on her heels. "And?" "Trial date is set, 8 months. She nodded, pressed her hands into the soil. 8 months was 8 months. It was what it was. The advocacy attorney had told her what to expect, had walked her through the process with the same practical clarity that Rowan had come to appreciate, and she had absorbed it and filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things she needed to carry without being crushed by them. "Vane's cooperation deal," she said, "still being negotiated. Webb says it'll close next month. His testimony plus the financial records is enough that the Hales don't have a viable defense." He paused. "It's going to hold, Rowan." She looked at the lavender she'd just put in. Small plants, both of them, the kind that needed time before they'd look like anything. The rosemary beside them was already responding to the cutting back, new growth at the base, the particular green of something that had been cramped and was beginning to have room. "I know," she said. They sat for a while. The sun was working its way across the garden, the particular movement of late morning light, unhurried. Birds in the hedge, the sound of the city beyond the estate walls, present but distant, the way the city always was from inside this space. Rowan pulled off her gardening gloves and looked at her hands, the scar on the right hand, the crooked finger, the line from the winter she was 16. All of it present, all of it unchanged, the record of a history that was not going anywhere and that she was not trying to make go anywhere, because the therapist she'd started seeing in the 3rd month had helped her understand, carefully, over several weeks, that disappearing the past was not the same thing as choosing the future, and that she had spent 24 years waiting for someone to erase what had been done to her when what she actually needed was to decide what came next. She was deciding. The mug slipped from the wall. It happened fast, and with the particular randomness of things that have no significance. Lucien's coffee mug, catching the edge of the stone unevenly, tipping. It hit the garden path and broke clean across the middle, the sound small and sharp in the quiet morning, coffee spreading across the pale stone. Rowan froze. 1 second. The reflex was still there, the intake of breath, the particular cold readiness of a body that had learned to brace, the almost muscular quality of the anticipation that had lived in her for so long it had its own address in her nervous system. 1 second. Then Lucien stepped around the pieces, not toward her, but simply around them, the way you move around something that's on the ground, and crouched to look at the break and said, "That was the good one," with the mild tone of a man mildly annoyed at a broken mug, and nothing else. No silence that had weight. No shift in the atmosphere of the garden. No cost. Rowan exhaled. It came out longer than a normal breath, the way something does when you've been holding it for longer than you knew. She looked at the 2 pieces of the mug on the garden path and the coffee already being absorbed by the pale stone, and she felt the reflex recede. Not gone, not entirely, not yet, maybe not ever entirely, but receding, moving back into its smaller territory, leaving more room around it than there had been before. She bent down and picked up the 2 pieces, looked at them, set them on the garden wall. "I'll get something to clean that up," she said. "Later," Lucien said. He stood from his crouch and looked at her in the direct way he'd looked at her hands that first night. The look that had started everything, and she held it without flinching, without the careful blankness, without any of the armor she'd spent 24 years assembling. Later, she agreed. She put her gloves back on and turned back to the lavender and gave it her attention, pressing the soil around the base of the second plant with both hands, firming it in, and the sun moved another degree across the garden, and the city went on beyond the walls, and somewhere in a federal filing system, 8 months of legal process waited to unfold, and the nonprofit's first intake appointment was scheduled for the following Wednesday, and her shoulder didn't hurt today, and the rosemary was going to be fine. She stayed in the garden until the light changed. When she finally stood and stripped off the gloves and looked at the kitchen garden in the afternoon, the lavender set in, the rosemary with its new growth, the stone path with the faint stain that would need attention later and would get it. She felt the particular quality of a thing that has reached its end and knows it. Not a loud end, not a triumphant one, the kind that arrives quietly, after a long time, and settles into the body like the deep tiredness that follows the work that needed doing. She picked up the 2 pieces of the broken mug from the wall, carried them inside, set them on the kitchen counter, not in the trash. She wasn't sure why, only that it felt like the right choice, to let them sit there for now, visible and broken and not requiring any particular response. The kitchen was warm. The afternoon light came through the window over the sink and caught the edge of the pieces and made them, for a moment, bright. She stood at the window and looked out at the garden and felt, in the quiet center of everything that had been and everything that was still coming, the specific and previously foreign sensation of being in a place that was hers, not borrowed, not temporary, not requiring performance or permission or the constant management of someone else's comfort, hers. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned from the window and went to find Lucienne, walking through the house that had once felt like an assignment and now felt like what it was, her footsteps even on the floor, her hands at her sides, open.